Welcome to the Poetry Room at City Lights. My name is Peter Maravellis. I'm the events director here at City Lights, and as always, I want to welcome those of you online as well. And we are, of course, beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. It is, of course, always an honor and a privilege to do so. So tonight's event is being co-produced with Seagull Books. I don't know how many of you know who Seagull Books, Seagull Press is. They're based in Calcutta, India, and they actually produce these beautiful catalogs each year. And there is a secret society of booksellers that collects these. And, you know, some are embossed, some are different shapes and sizes, and they're just beautiful artifacts. And I can't do it justice just kind of skimming through. But you can see the artwork. I mean, it's just gorgeous. At a time when publishers are eliminating print catalogs, Seagull's gone in a complete opposite direction. But if you think about who they have published over the last 40 years, it is just an amazing collection and curation of international authors, theorists, artists, playwrights, and so on and so forth. And of course, we are very delighted to have Sandip Roy here with us tonight. Celebrating Chapal Rani, the last queen of Bengal, the life and times of a female impersonator. And it traces the career of the legendary Bengali stage actor Chapal Bhaduri, the last great female impersonator of the Bengali theater. So the book really is the result of decades of research and very deeply personal interviews. The story also follows Calcutta's golden age of theater. Yes, indeed. Toggy knows what it's talking about. And at the same time, captures the rise and fall of a performer whose art was inseparable from his identity in a very, very moving portrait of gender and of belonging. So Sandip Roy is a writer, columnist, and podcaster currently living in Calcutta. He is columnist for Mint Lounge, The Hindu, and the host of the Sandip Roy Show on Indian Express. His work has appeared in the New York Times and the BBC and the San Francisco Chronicle and NPR. The list goes on for over a decade. He was the editor of Tricone, the world's oldest magazine on LGBTQ and South Asian issues. He's the author of the novel Don't Let Him Know. And we are very, very honored tonight to have in conversation with him Jeanne Carstensen. She's an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times and Foreign Policy, The Nation, and Salon, amongst others. She covered the Syrian refugee crisis in Greece and Turkey with support from the Pulitzer Center and was shortlisted for the Immigration Journalism Award. Her book, A Greek Tragedy, One Day, A Deadly Shipwreck and the Human Cost of the Refugee Crisis, was published in 2025 to high acclaim and is garnishing many, many, many accolades. The paperback edition is coming out very soon. We're going to have a Q&A towards the end. I ask you that please wait till I reach you with my microphone. Otherwise, our friends online are not going to be able to hear your questions. And for those of you online, please post your questions in the chat function from where we will call them. So now, please join us in giving a warm welcome to our guests. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you, Peter and City Lights, for having the wonderful Sandip Roy here, who those of us in the Bay Area have loved for a long time, and we still get to hear him on KALW. My ears always perk up when, yes, we hear that beautiful voice coming in. And in this book, you get to hear that beautiful voice and sensibility on the page. You are going to love this book. It's a little intimidating at 500 pages, but I went through it like nothing. And it's really an amazing achievement of creative nonfiction. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But here we are with this subject, a female impersonator and a star of a folk tradition from Bengal, and let's hear what this is. So I'd just like to start, Sandip, with tell us how you met Chapal Rani and how you decided to dedicate so much time to writing this book.
Thank you. And before I begin, I mean, it's great always to be back in San Francisco, and like there's no real better place to start a book tour in the US than right here in this bookstore. So thank you. So how did I meet Chapal Rani? So Chapal Rani is somebody I was aware of in the years that I was here. I knew of him, but I didn't really know him particularly. And then once what happened was this, as we were just hearing about Seagull books. Seagull produces a lot of very interesting books on subjects that other people might think are somewhat esoteric, or like, oh, why would you do this book on this kind of thing? And Chapal Rani was actually discovered or rediscovered by Naveen Kishore, who's the publisher and runs Seagull Books. Naveen Kishore, Chapal Rani had been sort of forgotten by everyone, and literally lived on the streets, almost begging, like, performed on the streets begging for money. Naveen Kishore did a set of photographs of him transforming himself into a goddess on the streets. Those pictures were picked up and shown in galleries and shows around the world, led to a renewed interest in him. Then one day, Chapal came to Naveen and said, can I get a job at Seagull? I can do anything. I can make tea. I can dust books. And Naveen was just kind of flabbergasted, because he was like, this is an artist. And, he wants to make tea to make living. And he was like, this is not right. So he raised the money to make a documentary on Chapal Bhaduri, for which he would pay Chapal. And that documentary was called Performing the Goddess. And that sort of led to a relationship between Seagull and Chapal. And to the extent that at some one point Chapal said, and that led to a sort of rediscovery of him. Then there were other plays, there were films, feature films that won awards based on his life story, and a whole new generation of people who were not necessarily followers of the jatra theater world he came from discovered him. And so then he always said that if anybody does writes my story in English, a language he couldn't speak, I would want Seagull to do it. And so at one point, Naveen came to me and said, this was because my last book came out a while back, and I had an event right here in this bookstore with Devia, who did it with me. So, and so, everybody kept saying like, oh, when are you writing your next book? When are you writing your next book? And you're like, yeah, it's happening. And I think Naveen thought, okay, this is a way to kick him into writing another book. And he approached me and said like, oh, do you want to take on this story? And I thought, this will be sort of easy. I'll go stick a mic in his face. He'll tell me his story in Bengali. I'll transcribe it. And within a few months, maybe at best a year, we'll have a book. And 5 years later, I was still slogging at him because A, he had an enormous story to tell, and B, he wasn't at all linear. Like I started the first day, I was like, okay, tell me about your child. What is your earliest memory of your childhood? And he said, my earliest memories. And then before I know it, he's like talking about something that happened yesterday, something that happened in 2000. He would just roam all over. So then just putting it together and kind of corralling his wild imagination was quite an effort, and it took it. But it was, for me, it was actually a huge journey of discovery, because I really didn't know. I mean, I was not a biographer who was very familiar with this world of jatra or knew of him at all. I knew the bare skeletons of the story, but kind of putting the flesh to it was educational for me in ways I never anticipated while doing it.
Yeah, I'm sure of that. And so tell us a little bit, just to set the scene, what is jatra? What is this theatrical tradition from Bengal?
So Jatra is like this folk theater of Bengal. It is like a traveling theater that goes around the country. And to set the context, it never got any respect because it was regarded as the kind of theater the common people, the less educated people, the people in the villages were watching. The theater that got respect was the proscenium theater that was in the city on a stage. Jatra tended to happen on a field. You would have an open stage. People would sit all around on four sides. So there was no, there might be a table like this, and this would be the throne. This would be the executioner's block. This would be the fortress from which the maiden would jump. This would be a thing in the battle. It would all like that. And uh, so it would happen that if you were in the jatra and you are killed on stage, right? You're assassinated, then then the audience will see you get up and walk off the stage. Also, you would die and get up and walk off the stage. And there was, like the great jatra actors were, like, for example, there was a story I'd heard about this jatra actor where, this man is kneeling in front of him, and this guy, the king, is like striking him on the head with the sword. And it's a very dramatic scene. But as he does it, the audience on this side complains they can't see him properly with the thing. So without missing a beat, they all like keep swivel around, and he does it again and again, so that audience on all sides get the full impact. And you don't break a sweat in doing that. So it required a special kind of talent. And they, at that time, there's no microphones, so you had to perform even a romantic scene in a way that could be heard by the people, the last of the 10,000 people who gathered to see you. And coming to the Chapal's part of the story, when this jatra starts, women are not allowed to perform in it because it's a traveling theater, and nobody wants, it wasn't regarded as safe or proper for women to be traveling on the roads for 6 months of the year, sleeping in, God knows what kind of place, in some village or something like that, with unknown men. And the other thing was, as I said, because there was no microphones, your voice had to carry right to the end. And so you needed to have, very few women had voices that were that powerful to do it. So out of those circumstances, it was men who played the roles of women in these jatra things. And these men became so famous, they were known as Ranis or queens. So Chapal was named Chapal Bhaduri, but when he became this famous female impersonator, he becomes known as Chapal Rani. And what Chapal does not realize, in a way, is the last of the Ranis, because after that, mics come into theater and there's chatra, and now there's not a technical problem in having women, and more women come in. And at one point, suddenly one day Chapal realizes that he's kind of, nobody needs him anymore.
So how did he get into it? He grew up in a very theatrical family, and his mother was famous actress, I think, but he sort of stumbled his way into this role. And yeah, tell us about that.
I should say a little bit about the mother. His mother was a famous theater actress of her time named Prabha Devi, and so at that time, theater is not regarded as a respectable profession for women in terms of getting in. And a lot of the press about his mother is written kind of couched in the way as to whether or not she came from the red light district. And a lot of time Chapal and his siblings spent in trying to dispel that story. But that story keeps coming up, and to this day I don't know, and honestly don't care, whether that's true or not. What I do know about the mother, and what is most impressive, is the mother actually had 6 children, of whom Chapal is the youngest. three are with a relationship when she's in a relationship with one man who again refuses to. I mean, she's referred to her. He's referred as her husband, but he never actually. He had a wife and family somewhere else. So this was his other relationship with whom he has three children, refuses to marry her and give her that sort of respectability. So she leaves him and she gets into a relationship with this other theater person who's Chapal's father and has three more children by him. She lives in one house with all six children from the three from the previous relationship, three from this relationship. And that house is bought by her with her own money as an actress. So the man who is Chapal's father really lives in a house that is owned by Chapal. The man comes from a very respectable theater family, but he lives in her house, which is I think quite an astonishing feat for this woman who came from nothing, no so-called pedigree. And I think Chapal was really enamored of his mother, like he really admired her. So he would tell all these stories about like she would go to act and he would be like sitting in the wings watching her. He would listen to her rehearse her lines and all of that. So he had the acting bug, but he didn't really, what he did was sometimes there would be in the plays the mother is doing, there would be a child's part. And once the child who was playing that part got sick, and somebody came and grabbed Chapal and said, like, come, you have to act in this. And he went, and he had nothing to do, he just has to sort of come on stage and maybe has one line or something. But in the end, he said he got 5 rupees for it, and he went home holding this 5 rupees, never spent it. But then the next day the boy gets well and comes back to work, and he's really crushed because he's got a taste for it. But he comes into acting really with the mother dies in her 50s suddenly, and leaves and the family falls apart because she, as I said, it was her money, it was her income that was holding the family together. He said about his father, he was a very good looking man, he did act somewhere. He was like the kind of person who came at the end of the play in the court scene. He was the judge, and he was very distinguished looking, so he could play the judge and give a verdict or something, but not. He was not going to make big bargain, not a leading man. And so the mother, when the mother dies, the family falls apart. The two halves, the three children from one relationship and the other three children don't really start getting along. Chapal is like in 12 or 13 years old. His education stops because really nobody's there to take care of him. He kind of bounces from sister to sister, and desperate to earn a living, somebody tells him that there's at that time the Indian railways, they used to have a lot of drama clubs, and these drama clubs would keep putting on these plays all the time. And again, in the same way, the railways at that time, men worked in it, and so men played the roles of women in these drama clubs. So they were always looking for men who could play female parts. And someone said like, oh, you're kind of an effeminate boy, do you want to play, try this? And he was like, what, play? But I'm a boy, like how can I play a woman? And said, but a lot of people do it. You try it. It's good money, and you might even get a railways job. So he goes to do it in the hopes that he'll get some kind of a railway job. And he does. And he said it's a job called chain man. And it required him, you have to go out in the sun, measure things in the sun. He said, but I never had to do anything because, I couldn't be out in the sun all day. My complexion would be ruined. And then how could I be playing the lissom heroine of my plays?
Yes, so he goes from there and gets recruited by some of these jatra companies, and he quickly becomes quite successful and draws huge crowds, and top billing is Chapal Rani. And some of my favorite parts of the book are, so something we should talk about is the introduction is in the first person in your voice, and you know, talk about it, people you've interviewed, and it's somewhat scholarly and you have your own point of view. And then most of the book, it switches about a quarter of the way through, and it's written through his voice. So it reads completely in a novelistic first person sort of way. And then that is divided, and you put in these interludes, I think you call them, that are these fictional parts, which we can talk about in a minute. But his voice is tremendous, and the amount of detail. I mean, anybody who loves theater would love this book, because all his details about the makeup and the scenes and memorizing the lines and all the stagecraft. And so talk a little bit about that, and also about his ability to completely, this transformation he would make from being Chapal Bhaduri to being Chapal Rani. And it was a total transformation.
Yeah, he would say often that the way it would happen for him is, and actually, this is not just him saying it. People he worked with later in life, also when I interviewed them, said, yeah, there was this weird thing that's happening. And these are not necessarily people who are like super into queer representations or very sensitive to these issues. They said like before this thing, because Chapal is a very jovial kind of chatty man, avuncular almost, and they would say like, yeah, before that, we'd all be like, hey, Chapal da, and we clapping him on the back and everything. But then as soon as starts changing, they would say like a sort of reserve would come upon us as well. We'd almost feel like now we can't slap him on the back. Now we have to maintain a certain distance from him in a way, like now there's a lady in our midst. And he would often say in different interviews that as he did his makeup, he would feel himself transforming, so that finally when he puts on the lipstick and draws the eyes, it's complete. And at that moment, he would say he could not even, it's not even that he couldn't think of himself as a woman anymore, but at that moment, he would almost have to never think that he was ever a man at all. At that moment, he said, if at that moment I didn't think that I was a woman named Chapal Rani, the audience wouldn't believe me either. So for that part of that performance, it's almost like the audience and he had to enter into a kind of secret pact, a sort of suspension of disbelief that was mutually agreed upon, where for these 2 hours, 3 hours that you will be performing, you are a woman. And to the point that years later, when he's really down in the dumps and he has no roles as women, he plays this sort of goddess traveling on the streets and act. And he said so in India, like Hindu women put this sindoor, which is this vermilion streak on your hair to signify marriage. And married women would come up to, and married women often do that to each other as a way to say, may your married life be happy and may you never become a widow and things like that. It's common. So he said women would come up to him and they would say they would want to do that to him. And he would say, but why, but I'm not a woman, I'm a man, and your husband is right there sitting. And the women would say, no, we know that, but my husband is, for this time right now, when you're dressed like this, you are a woman, you are a mother, you are this things, and we will treat you that way. And so and I think for me, what was the huge learning thing about it is that, I came of age as a queer person in San Francisco. This is where I learned about, this is where I edited a magazine called Tricone, which is where I learned about LGBTQ issues and stuff. So we tend to often think that this terminology, this movement, the parameters of this movement, the contours of the movement have been shaped in places like San Francisco and New York and stuff. And to a certain extent, that is true. And then you meet somebody like Chapal, who lives outside these parameters entirely, and yet in 1961 is leading this life where he is switching between man and woman effortlessly on stage without feeling any need to put any label on it. He just doesn't care about the labels.
Yeah, it's amazing. Maybe now is a good time to have you read
Sure.
a little bit, because he would often be confused for a woman and pursued after these performances or during these performances.
I'll read a little bit from the section which is about how he transforms himself and what happens when. So that I'll just read two little bits from the same section. So this is so what is a woman without breasts? When I began, we just had little mounds of rags that were held in place by cloth and then tied at the back. We had no bras or bodices, but if you tied it correctly, it would not shift while acting, and you could wear a blouse on top of it. But an actor once told me he hated to embrace me on stage. My breasts were too hard, he said. They poked when he bumped against them. So I went to Newmarket to find the right kind of sponge and stuffed that in little pouches. It looked a bit like the masks people wore on their faces during COVID. Those became my breasts. In Chotasri, I played Jharna, daughter of a minister in a royal court. She's in love with a military commander named Muktaporno, who joins the service of a rival king and comes to fight against his former kingdom. And I'll give you a little sense of the kind of dialogue. All the dialogue in the book was basically recited by him from memory. These plays don't. He's 88 years old, and he has acted in these plays in like 1961 or 62, and he would recite entire pages because I had no way to check them because the plays don't exist anymore. They're out of print. So Jharna says, and so when I would first interview him, in fact, he would suddenly I would ask him a question. He was like, yeah, it was like in that play, and then he would start reciting the dialogue. And I'm like, oh, this is a lot of wasted tape now. Like, what am I going to do with 5 minutes of him reenacting the thing? And then I realized that those were like some really golden moments because nobody else remembers that. I mean, this man it's an archive just walking around. So he says, Jharna says in the play, I thought you loved me. You have given my father your word that you will marry me, and now you've come to do battle against my father, siding with the enemy. What kind of love is this? Muktaporno says, love is love, but I cannot go against my duty. Jharna says, I will not stand for this. You cannot come against us like this. Let's make a wager. Let's see how many soldiers you can slay, and let us see how many I can. Muktaporna says, Jharna, what are you saying? You're a woman and you will come to the battlefield? Yes, I will. And I will go in such a fashion that every soldier will be so dazzled by my beauty that they will rush towards me like moths drawn to a flame. And as they fight among themselves, I will kill them with my own hands. What a scene that was! I made the sponge breasts a little larger than usual, exactly like two halves of a coconut. After I fixed them on myself with spirit gum, you could hardly tell they were artificial. I painted my body the same color as the breasts because I had to perform that scene bare-bodied. Then I draped a very fine red, almost sheer Banarasi cloth around myself so that if I leaned forward, the cloth would slip and reveal my cleavage. In those days, electric lights had not come to Jatra. The cleavage, lit by the glow of Petromax lamps, would drive the audience absolutely wild. This was not something I invented. All the great queens of Jatra, like Chobi Rani and Babli Rani, used this trick. I learnt it from them. So then he goes on to say, so then he's, dressed up and he does these parts. So one time he says he's playing a young woman being raised as an unmarried girl in a rich father's house. And then she finds out that she was once married, her husband is dead. So she has to quickly exit the scene and change from a green silk sari to a white sort of widow's sari. At a performance in Jamshedpur, I was on my way to the green room to change my sari when suddenly I felt I was floating in the air. Before I even realized what was happening, some strapping young Sikh men had grabbed me, picked me up, and deposited me in their jeep. The organizers and stagehands came rushing out, shouting, "Stop, stop! What are you doing?" The men had thought I was a real woman and decided to abduct me. A tug of war ensued. The Jatra people were holding on to my left arm, while my love struck kidnappers hung tight to the other. "I am going to take you home with me," said one. "Come with me, darling, marry me," laughed another. "But this is our actor. He's a man," protested one of the members of our troupe. "No, that can't be." Finally, I had to take off my wig to prove that I was actually a man. By then, I was entirely disheveled. My clothes were torn, my makeup a mess. Somehow, I managed to pull myself together and finish my performance. After that incident, whenever the green room was at some distance from the stage, I would insist that someone accompany me there. Another time, while acting in Plabon, blinded by all the lights, I tripped and fell and broke my wrist. I was rushed to Bangur Hospital in South Kolkata, groaning in pain. I was still in a sari because I had no time to change. The medical staff took one look at me and tried to send me to the maternity ward, convinced I was having labor pains. I had to curse at them and scream for my wig to be taken off. Now it seems funny. At that time, it didn't feel that way.
Well, you can see why he would emerge later as a gay icon in Calcutta when new generations are discovering the fabulous figure and so many stories like that. But yet he doesn't really relate to the language as you were talking about before. And one thing he said to you at some point was, you know, he doesn't see himself as gay or transgender. And he says, "I am not third gender, I am first gender." What did he mean by that? And how did you respond to it?
Um, I think what he meant by that was very clear that, people would say that, oh, you act as a woman on stage, you're a woman on stage. A lot of people say, like, have you thought about having gender reassignment surgery done? Because that, you want to live in a woman. And he was quite clear in that he kept saying, like, I don't want to be a woman. I want to, for that time that I'm on the stage, I want to convincingly play a woman in a way that is believable to you as well. But I don't want to live as a woman. I have no, when I'm off stage, I have no desire to dress in women's clothes. I wear my own sort of men's clothes. Now, the interesting thing is, i- this is 1960s India. Now we just live in this hypothetical, like if Chapal had been around now, okay, and going through these things, perhaps he would have a different relationship with his body and sexuality and all of that. We could say that maybe this was his way of trying to fit into that world he lived in. Made it an asset, and much more as sort of this girly sissy boy or something like that. But the jatra stage, like people were like, oh, okay, he's an actor, he's Chapal Rani, so we don't mess with him. But it allowed him to exist in on his own terms in some fashion, where I perhaps you could say that maybe he figured out that, okay, I'm okay, this is all right on the stage, as long, but off stage I'll dress as a man because that's still socially acceptable. Or perhaps that's how he was. It's impossible for me to now figure out. I can only go by his word, which is why I realize, you asked what did I make of him. A lot of times I would ask him questions, but in the end, I felt like, as the person entrusted with telling his story, my responsibility was to tell his story as he wanted it said, not my interpretation or my psychoanalysis of what his story is about, which is why then you talked about the fictional interludes. They were a way for me to explore some of those questions that came up in terms of how did other people regard him and stuff like that. In a way that was, then it felt like it wasn't me imposing these thoughts, these ideas, these questions on him. Like, it was kind of like, it would have been like me asking things he'd never thought about at all about himself. I'm like, so he's didn't ever think of himself as transgender. So now why would I, like, suddenly, if I was trying to quiz him on gender dysphoria, it just felt unfair.
Yeah. Yeah. What would be the point of that?
And I'll tell you one little thing that reminded me is that, so as we're doing in 2000 in India, homosexuality was criminalized for many years. British era law and everything. There had been lawsuits going on against it and everything. Activists fighting against it. And then in 2018, the court finally decriminalizes homosexuality. So it's big news. It's covered everywhere. Everyone's on TV talking about it. So obviously, some journalist comes to Chapal as sort of the queer elder kind of person to ask him, what do you make of it? And this is 2018. So he's already probably late 70s by then, maybe 80 or something. And he says, me? Well, when I was doing anything, I had no idea this law existed. And now my shop has been shut a long time. So what does it matter what the law says?
Well, he did have love in his life. He speaks of somebody you call X in the book, 34 years. And something I found interesting was how he describes the fluidity of the Ranis in general, that many of them married and had children. Some didn't. He decided not to. He at least didn't feel that any of the Ranis needed to sort of define themselves one way or another. But he describes he had one great love, X.
Yeah, I sometimes think, like, rather than homosexual or bisexual or something, he was sort of he's actually the great romance sexual. So I think he had this romantic vision. He's 18, X is 22. They meet, they sort of fall into a relationship even before either of them realize what's going on. It's kind of like our sort of gay dream of, you find this person and it'll be forever happily ever after. Except this is 1960s India. X gets married and he's okay with it. Chapal is like, yeah, well, he would want to have children and everything, so I can't. He's like, I can do everything. I can cook, clean, I can do everything, very traditional female roles, but except I can't bear children, so he has to have children. So X marries, X has children, and as it turns out, Chapal ends up living in the house with X and his family and the children. And at one point, their relationship has now like the passion is not quite there anymore. So he's sort of a glorified. By then, his jatra career has ended. Um, and it's a very funny bit. So the ex like loves him. Ex's mother adores him, like all people adoring the gay son-in-law. The mother adores him, entrusts him with all her sort of religious duties and stuff. Only person who does not like him is ex's father, who, not because of necessarily the gay thing, but ex's father thinks that Chapal will somehow like cast a spell on his son and make him invest all his money into one of these jatra companies, and they'll all go down the drain. And so then when Chapal is he has no work anymore and he's literally looking for he can't afford the rent. He asks X, like, oh, can you provide help? And so X says, well, I can send you some money, but you can't live in the house because my father is here and he will not stand for it. He will be upset. Then at one point the X comes to him and says, actually now my father has glaucoma, so you can stay now because he can't see. So he was large house. He's not going to notice you in the house. So so Chapal comes and lives with glaucoma father-in-law and X's like children who all call him uncle and everything. And so for 30 years, and that is the great love story. And he will not, on the pain of death, reveal who X is. Comes from a wealthy family, and I've read his sister's memoir and stuff, and I have some inkling who X might have been from like overlapping things, but because he's like let slip a few times where he worked and things like that. But X was like his dream man, and he takes great pains in his story of saying that was his one and only. And he said many other opportunities came after that, but I never pursued them, not because they were bad or anything, but I felt like nobody would give me more than I had gotten with X. So he never, and I don't know whether that was entirely the truth or that was a romanticized view of the relationship that he wanted to live with. But I'll defer to him. The relationship in the end did not end well. It ended very sadly.
Is it described
It is
in the movie?
so luckily this good thing about writing nonfiction, I realize, and is that they're not really spoilers in the sense of like writing a thriller where like, oh, I give away the plot twist or something. um the relationship with X ends 30 plus years later when X gets involved with another woman. And he, by then, the father is dead. So now X, I think, feels like he can do whatever he wants. And he wants to move this woman into an apartment in that same house. And X's wife, who was fine with Chapal in that relationship, cannot stand for this other woman who will now come, right? Because now she will lose face in a way she would not. So she comes. So then Chapal stands up to X on behalf of the wife. Uh, and X sort of arrogantly says, what are you talking about? You are the same. I mean, basically saying like you're like, you're my mistress. You were my mistress once. Now I am having this other person as a mistress who happens to be a woman. And Chapal says, no, it wasn't the same. Because that one, your wife, treated me as a brother, sister, whatever, like a thing. So there was that understanding. I was not Tinizet, I was not disrespecting his relationship with the man had started before the wife had come into the picture, but they had somehow in an unspoken way made accommodated each other in their lives. This person was rupturing that thing. And so Chapal walks out of that relationship. And which is why when we research the book, there are almost no pictures of Chapal in his young day because most of those pictures had been with X, who did not return the pictures to him. So the photographs were all thrown away, destroyed, whatever. And X just passed away 2 years ago. I had gone to see Chapal, who lives in an old age home, and we were talking, and I said, "Oh, and he said, oh, his daughter just called and said, father has passed away. And I said, oh, and what did you feel? And he said, nothing, everything. And he was very philosophical about it. But there was one very telling little story. I mean, where he once told me a story about how he had gone to perform somewhere, and suddenly somebody calls, says, see. And he turns around and sees it's the daughters of X who had come to see him. They had heard he was performing. They used to call him C. And he was seeing them after a decade or something. Then he asked them, how was your father? And all of that and everything. So he told me that story. When I was interviewing somebody else who knew him, who had been at that place, he told me separately that same story, but he with one detail different. He said, yeah, I went there and I found Chapal sitting on the stage and like sitting here on the chair and weeping his eyes, crying his eyes out. And was like, what happened? He said, no, X's daughters had come after so many years, and he heard that X was ill and not well, and he was he told me the story just to say that. But then they called him on stage, and he immediately switched into his full diva mode and performer and everything to show how sort of performer he was. But for me, when I heard that story, it was like, oh, when he told me, he left out the tears because he didn't want it to be known that he wanted to feel like, no, I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm a survivor. I'm doing fine.
He may have done that throughout his life, as a way to survive. As a last question, I'm curious, has he seen the book? I know at the end of his life, as a jatra artist, there's not much pension. His parents are gone. So what is he doing now? How is he doing? And have you been able to show him the book?
Yeah. Every time, all through the years while I'm interviewing him, not initially, but maybe 6 months. Probably Chapal had the same idea as I did, that he'd talk for about a few months, it would be done. When this few months has stretched to years, at some point he would sometimes say, do you? So he had this very high voice. I'll say it in Bengali and translate it. হ্যাঁ বলছি মানে বইটা হবে তো, which is basically sort of very tremulously saying, is this book going to happen at all, or are you just going to endlessly ask me questions and go away? And so then couple of years ago, unfortunately, he had a stroke, and so he lives in an old age home, and he was sort of confined to bed. And at that time, I remember even before the book was done, we took the once the cover was done, we made a poster of the cover and framed it and took it for him so that he could have something. Then when the actual book was done, I took it, and he's like now, he has to have a 24/7 an attendant who looks after him and stuff, and he sort of lost mobility in his hand, so he can't. It's kind of a heavy book anyway, but he can't, he doesn't have the strength to lift it up. So I was holding it for him, and in his hand, and he said, wow, 500 pages. So he was really, I mean, he was really amazed that. But then he would promptly looking at, there are pictures in the book, and I was showing him the pictures, and he promptly went, he was like, oh yeah, this guy was my hero. Oh, this one was rubbish. He was a rubbish hero. This one was a very good one. We had a good match. So I mean, then like even after like his limbs are not working the way he wants to, he's lost a lot of mobility and all of that, but the head and that spirit, that is still sparkling.
He didn't consider himself a drag queen and would say that he didn't perform a woman's role, but he became a woman. But now that with your book and ongoing interests, I'm curious, are there drag queens, that kind of performance in Calcutta? And is anybody performing Chapal Rani?
I oddly, just as I was coming here, somebody sent me an sort of announcement about a play that is going to happen in Calcutta based on that, performing the goddess thing that the documentary on Chapal Rani is about. And he was really the last of his kind, because there was no need for jatra queens like this anymore, because women were playing and jatra itself was changing. But there have been a few people who have tried to come in his footsteps, and they do it in not so much because there's a need, but as a sort of specialty thing, or they'll act in some plays and things like that. So there have been a few people, but he'll say, yes, yes, I give them all my blessing, but let's see who can become another Chapal Rani. But he also says, even if, but he acknowledges that, he says that if I came about now, I don't know if I would become Chapal Rani again. He said, I didn't realize it, but I was lucky that I was at that end of that era. I didn't realize the era was ending, but that I managed to be at the end. So I sort of walked out. I mean, he's like he was only like 30 something years old when his jatra career ends, because he's been acting since his teens, and now he's in his 80s. So he has a rebirth as a queer icon, and in stage and film after that. So he's very unique in the sense that he's acted in jatra and theater and television and film, and and he even like he came to perform in Vancouver. He spoke no English, and he came with a colleague from Seagull, Shulandini, and they landed in Vancouver, and she found her suitcase had not arrived. And he has meanwhile, his feet have swollen on the flight, so he can't get into his shoes anymore. So he's walking around the Vancouver airport bare feet, and she hasn't got her suitcase. He's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And he's like, oh, don't worry. Here is something my profession will come in useful. I have some extra saris and petticoats you can borrow in my trousseau.
Well, thank you, Sandip.
Thank you, Dave.
Here we go.
Get your questions ready.
So we have something from online. Let's see.
Oh,
NKA says, did Jatra play to urban or rural audiences? Are performers paid by a village or individual viewers?
Are performed paid by.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Jatra played all over the state. So it's played largely to villages, but also in cities. It would play in, so the Jatra offices were in the city. And from there, Jatra managers would come and see the plays being performed. Sometimes they would take over a local market at night and have the performance. Then the people would come and say, companies would come and decide, like, oh, okay, this is a jatra I want on my roster. And then they would hire them to go and tour around the country. So for several months of the year, they would tour all over the state, including villages, collieries, factory towns, tea garden estates, and perform Like they'd go to one place for 3-4 nights and perform 4 different plays all night long. And they were paid by the company. They were employed by the company. So the company would hire them. And Chapal remembers when he was first hired as sort of the entry level, he goes to have lunch. His great attraction was he felt like, oh, you get wages and you get meals. So he thought he was just like the cushiest job ever. But he goes to have lunch and he gets lunch in this little enamel plate. He said, like the kind they give, like, oh, the only places I'd seen plates like that were with like tuberculosis patients in hospitals. And he was like, I don't want to eat in a plate like that. And they were like, no, you're 100 rupee level employee. That's all you get. When you get to 300 rupees, you'll get a better plate and 2 pieces of fish. Now you just get, you just keep it. And so then he said, but I got to 300. Within 2 years, I was a 300 rupee employee.
Anybody in here?
There was a hand up.
Yes.
So the book is not out in India yet. Is that correct?
No, it is out in India. Yes.
What's the buzz that you're hearing? Is there anything controversial about it?
Well, Hillary's trying to stir up trouble. The book just came out in India in January, actually. It released at the Jaipur Literature Festival. And I've done several events in India before coming here. I think the one thing that it hasn't yet. So there've been excerpts and stuff. There haven't been very many reviews as of yet. But the thing that might cause some buzz or controversy is, so Chapal becomes very famous towards the end when a very well-known director named Rituparno Ghosh acts in a film based on Chapal's story. That sort of puts him on sort of an international it's called Just Another Love Story, and it's like regarded as one of the first sort of queer Bengali films in the 2011, something 2010, sometime around that, or maybe a little earlier than that. And so that makes Chapal very famous. But in the course of when I was talking to him, he told me that he was unhappy with the film because he felt that Rituparno, who is a big star was a big star director, really dealt with these issues of sexuality and a queer icon in the legitimate sense. He felt that Rituparno kind of took his story and made it his story, and he felt like when he was watching it on the screen, he felt like it wasn't like that someone had taken his story. And they were like, they paid me and they fulfilled all their contracts, but I felt like it became Rituparno's story and not mine anymore. Like I'm there in the film, but then I disappear. And Rituparno died some time back, so he can't really respond to this. But the man who directed the film sort of agreed with it, and he said this was a case where Rituparno was the star, and when the media would come for interviews, they would all go to Rituparno, the star, and I would feel at some point, he said, I stopped asking Chapal to come to these because I would feel like without this man, the story would not have been possible. And yet he's the one, nobody's interviewing him. Everyone's interviewing the star.
I have another question here in the room. Do you know whether there is any known relationship between Chapal Rani's stage name and Chapal Roan's stage name, or is the similarity merely coincidental?
I think it's coincidental.
Let's see. I have another one from online. Who in urban society today would remember live performances of his formerly rural residents, or did Chapal perform in city venues?
He performed in rural and city venues, and there are a lot of people who remember him. In fact, people have come up after at the books and talked about like either they or their parents had seen him. Because even for people in cities during big festivals, the jatra companies would come and perform in cities, and so it was a big thing to go. And one of the great highlights for me in the course of it, when the book had its launch in Kolkata, during this sort of audience Q&A session that was happening afterwards, this man came up and took the microphone and he said, uh, and he said, oh, I have a question, but actually I don't have a question. My name is Babulal Dash, and my father was Rakhal Rani. And I was like, who's mentioned? Rakhal Rani is a predecessor of Chapal Rani. He's like one of the older queens who was renowned in his time as this impersonator. And there were like these stories about how he apparently trained himself, his voice by being submerged in water for hours at the end and talking and training his voice and all of that. But he was very renowned and then ended up with nothing. He was literally on the streets selling peanuts for a living, making tea. He'd got all these medals which he had melted and sold away, which was the story of all these Rani. There's another Rani called Horipad Rani who was like Jatras ran on his name. And in the end, after it was over, he ended up committing suicide because he couldn't afford blood pressure medicines and things for his own family. He hanged himself. His wife found him hanging from a tree. And Rakhal Rani was found on the street by the man who used to write these jatra plays, who was a headmaster in a school nearby. And he was like, wow, this was my heroine. And he is now like in rags selling peanuts on the street. Someone's is like a Jatra queen who was known as the Elizabeth Taylor of Bengali Jatra. In later life was stitching petticoats and blouses for a living. And they didn't want to be reminded of that past life, because they were embarrassed about their current predicament. So this playwright finds him on the street. He's a school headmaster. So he gets him a job in the school as sort of a clerk or something like that, just to get a roof over his head, and he moves him in with his family. That somehow manages to get a foothold. Family reestablishes himself, and the man dies. And Chapal talks about going to his funeral and everything. And then the man's son, I had got some pictures for the book from him. He took a train and came to the event because even though the book is not about his father, he said, it is about my father.
Back here.
Why don't you? Okay. So these interviews were done in Bengali, or and how, I assume it was done in Bengali. How difficult was it for you to get the correct interpretation of some of the things he said and translate it into English? And I think
it was all done in Bengali because that's the only language he really speaks. And I think some of them were, some things were, I mean, as a native Bengali speaker, I would have to say it was harder than I thought it would be, because it was not a matter of translation. Some things there were just some words that didn't really exist. They were jatra terms. For example, he would say like, oh, we had this music, he would go pa, 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 and we called it the clarionet, which doesn't really actually, so it's like comes from the word clarinet that we know. And then you like stuck like, should I call it a clarionet, should I call it a clarinet? And so then I sort of have to call it both by saying like, it's called this kind of thing. But I think the harder thing for me was, and this as a writer, was to let his voice, like, try and stay as true as I could to his voice, so that it had to sound like, when, since it's being written in the first person, it had to sound not just that that man had been talking in Bengali, but that it had to sound like Chapal was telling the story, not me. And that's where sort of my editor also came in, where she would take some parts and she would say, okay, this part is nice, but it sounds like you. He wouldn't make, he wouldn't compare this thing to, this kind of simile or something that's not. And she knew him, knows him well too. So there we would have to prepare down, which is where the fictional interludes come in handy, because those are, I can be, it can be sort of in my voice, because there I am not trying to be true to his voice. So that was the harder thing, where to keep the certain rhythm of the Bengali and to remember that this is being done in Bengali, yet to hopefully not make it sound like it's just like a Google Translate of what he was saying. And but at the same time, I guess to answer it, it would be like, I tried to keep the rhythm of the language in which he was speaking, and to make it sound like this person was talking, without it being feeling like it was being forced or something like that. But the painful part, and which is where some people really helped, was sitting and transcribing those hours of interview. And then that's after that the translation can begin, actually.
Sandip, I just want to say thank you for an extraordinary project. What
Thank you.
an amazing thing that you've done. And I just wanted to reflect on that. In the United States, we have our versions of him, of Chapal, who, like the Jay Medna or Freddie Mercury in some sense, or the popular culture, Paul Lynde from Hollywood Squares, like we have these touchstones of people who gave us hope in the early 60s in our popular culture. And if you can just reflect on how extraordinary this is, that you're exposing Chapel to us and this amazing story, like, just you as a conduit for this story, like how that feels for you right now.
Yeah, that's a tricky question in a way, and I sort of address it a little bit in my own introduction. As I said, I sort of came of age as a queer person here. Before this is where I became part of a South Asian LGBTQ group. This is where I found sort of organized life. I became, I joined the board of the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission and Frameline. And so I found a kind of way of being gay in a more holistic, integrated, in the sense of society world that was around us. And I started editing this magazine called Trikon, which is the oldest South Asian LGBTQ magazine, started here, marching in pride parades in San Francisco and all of that. And I realized that, and in those days when instances of South Asian and queer were very few and far between, any kind of reference we could find, we would shove into the magazine. Like our friends, some of whom are here, ended up being on the cover of the magazine, because we were like, we need models, we have no models, so like, someone, yeah, you get onto the cover, you're like. And we had photo shoots in our house and our backyard, and we were like putting everything on the cover of the magazine. And if we found a book in which Vikram said Suitable Boy, which I don't know how many if you have read, deep inside the book there is a small gay subplot in the character. We were like, oh my God, on page 237, there's like some instance of a gay romance. Let's do a whole feature story about it. Some South Asian actress has played a lesbian in some indie film, Fresh Kill, I remember, with Sarita Chaudhary. We'll go and interview Sarita Chaudhary now. Like probably the only interview this poor thing did for that indie film, which showed in 3 festivals. We would do all that. But I never covered Chapal, who was around in that, who was this leading this life in playing these roles, leading this life, and he just existed on the fringes, periphery of my subconscious, because the world he occupied, jatra, was not a world I was very familiar with, and so I did not give it much heed in that sense. So it is only so, in a way, writing this has belatedly been, I won't say an apology necessarily, but a way to make up for that fact that I neglected the most sort of striking example of hope, of living outside the societally prescribed norms and living this unashamed open life, that the hope that represented, that I had never acknowledged it in my own work, which could have probably given so many other people hope, because I think it's like an enormous act of courage that at a time when his sister tells him, like, now you should get married, he says no. He says, I don't want to ruin a woman's life. She says, many other Jatra queens like you have gotten married, they have children. He's like, yeah, maybe they have, but they're different. I don't want to ruin anyone's life.
Well, we have come to the top of the hour. We have so many more questions, but Jeanne, thank you for doing the honors. You were so thoughtful and generous. And Sandip Roy, thank you and congratulations.